Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another easy PvE build guide. Today's build of choice is Power Vindicator. Power Vindicator is a very strong and straightforward damage build for instance content. The duration I use here uses dual swords, but it works in a similar way with Hammer and Greatsword too. Vindicator is also a great pick for solo gameplay as it can provide itself with good amounts of the most essential offensive and defensive boons: quickness, protection, fury and might. Through its frequent dodges, it can also avoid a lot of incoming damage and therefore be quite survivable even in damage gear. Before we dive into the rotation concept, let's do a quick rundown of the key essential mechanics of Vindicator. On Vindicator, your dodge becomes an integral part of your damage rotation. Instead of diving into a specific direction, it causes you to jump into the mists and deal damage upon landing by default. With the trait Forerunner of Death, you gain 25% strike damage done for 10 seconds whenever you dodge. This is one of the strongest single damage modifiers in the game. It is therefore crucial to dodge at least once every 10 seconds. That's not a problem though, because your dodge is great damage too. The requirement to dodge frequently is reinforced by the trait Leviathan Strength, which increases your damage done when your endurance is not full. Another part of the professional mechanics on Vindicator is Energy Melt. By default, this skill grants you 25 endurance for 10 energy. The damage rotation will use the trait Reaver's Curse to reduce the cooldown of Energy Melt and double the damage that our dodges deal. Whenever you use Energy Melt, you gain a buff for 6 seconds that empowers your dodge. As an alternative, in case you want to have extra energy on demand, you can also make use of Ancient's Trust. This removes the energy cost and grants 25 energy instead. This can be helpful if you want to use costly skills and doesn't cost too much damage. Alright, let's dive into the rotation concept, starting with the opener. For the opener of the rotation, you want to start in Legendary Alliance stance. First, use Energy Melt and the Spear of Archemerus. Spear of Archemerus deals damage with a 3-second delay, allowing you to precast it without entering combat immediately. Then dodge right after to make use of the buff from Reaver's Curse and to benefit from Forerunner of Death and Leviathan Strength immediately. Then use the 3 sword skills Shackling Wave, Death Strike and Chilling Isolation. Then swap to Legendary Assassin stance and activate the skill Impossible Odds right after. And from this point on, the general rotation loop starts. The general rotation involves swapping between Legendary Alliance stance and Legendary Assassin stance and using a list of priority damage skills on cooldown. In Legendary Assassin stance, you start with 50 energy. Impossible Odds is an upkeep skill. This will cost 5 energy to activate it and then drain 1 point per second over 10-second duration. If we deduct that from the 50 energy that we have left, you can spend 35 energy in total. You always want to use Chilling Isolation twice to maintain the buff from the Relic of the Thief. This costs 10 energy. You should spend the remaining energy for Energy Melt, Shackling Wave and Death Strike. Since we only have 25 energy left when using Chilling Isolation twice, you usually don't have enough energy to use all 3 of the skills I listed before. It's not a big deal, just skip one of them and use it in Alliance stance later. The Legendary Alliance stance is more liberal on energy usage as it does not include an upkeep skill like Impossible Odds. You always want to start and end Alliance stance with Spear of Archemerus. This is the strongest skill on it and has a 10-second cooldown with Alacrity, meaning you can only use it twice without delaying the rotation when you use it as the first skill. This will slightly delay the swap to Shiro. Other than that, use the same skill as I listed before on cooldown. On top of these skills, you can use Nomad Advance twice and still have enough energy to use Spear of Archemerus a second time towards the end. After the second cast of Spear of Archemerus, swap over to Shiro and restart the rotation from there. On top of this one weapon rotation, I also have an alternative Juggernaut rotation on the wiki page that you can check out. It uses Greatsword and Hammer to fulfill everyone's Juggernaut dreams. Using a rotation with one weapon set only has the advantage that it allows you to run any weapon you want on the secondary weapon bar. This is especially important when it comes to open world gameplay and Defiance bar damage. In terms of CC skills, it therefore depends on which weapon you put there. Staff has Surge of the Mists, which is one of the strongest CC skills in the game. Hammer allows you to play a large part of the rotation from range if you need to and also includes another CC skill. Another CC skill that you always have access to is Reaver's Rage, which you can find in the Alliance stance. Finally, the elite skill in Shiro does decent Defiance bar damage, but it's way too costly to use it. Alright, moving on to gear. We're going to use a full set of Berserkers with ideally superior runes of the Dragon Hunter on them. If you only have Scholar runes lying about, it's also fine to use those. The damage difference is negligible. In terms of sigils on the weapons, we're going to use sigils of Force and Air. The damage difference between air and impact sigils is very small, so use whatever you have. In terms of traits, we're going to use Invocation, Devastation and Vindicator. In instance content, you shouldn't really change any of these traits because they yield the highest damage. Spirit Boon and Invocation helps covering Vigor on yourself, which is a quite important boon on Power Vindicator. Okay, so far for instance content, let's dive into Open World. For Open World, it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that it can sustain on your own. As is the case for many power builds, making adjustments to increase survivability on Power Vindicator comes at around a 1-to-1 trade-off in damage. That's not really a problem though, because for the vast majority of Open World content, it is enough to change to Dance of Death and Devastation and swap out the legendary Assassin stance for the legendary Dwarf stance. The trait Dance of Death gives you stacks of battle scars whenever you apply vulnerability to enemies. Hitting an enemy while you have stacks of battle scars steals health from enemies, so it heals you. Dual Swords synergize very well with this trait as they hit frequently and apply vulnerability on the auto attack chain and on Shackling Wave. On top of that, your heal skill in the Alliance stance and your dodge will further apply vulnerability stacks whenever you hit enemies with them. That way you generate quite a bit of passive healing. Using Chalice, or the legendary Dwarf stance, provides survivability in several ways. Vengeful Hammers is an upkeep skill. This reduces all incoming damage by 20% while it is active, triggers battle scars on every hit and heals you every time too. This makes using it priority number 1 in legendary Dwarf stance. You can generate stacks of battle scars with your dodge, auto attacks or Shackling Wave and then consume them with the hammers. A second very powerful skill in Open World is Forced Engagement. This tethers you to an enemy for 4 seconds and reduces the damage taken from the target by 33%, all the while providing around 300 Defiance bar damage over its duration. This is very strong, don't underestimate this. On top of these trait changes, I like to use Ancient's Trust in Open World. This gives you endurance and energy on demand via Energy Melt, which is great to sustain Vengeful Hammers for longer, or provide yourself and allies with stability via Inspiring Reinforcement. Using a hammer can help avoid damage that you'd otherwise take by kiting at range. Hammer further removes the requirement to run to every mob in Open World through its high range, which is pretty convenient. It does pretty good damage after the buffs to it. Both Coalescence of Ruin and Drop the Hammer are very strong for damage. But that's not all. Hammer 3 and 4 provide a short cooldown block and evade, which is pretty massive for survivability. If you want to solo harder content in Open World, you can make use of Vassals of the Empire and Vindicator and a Camp Hammer. Covering protection from Vassals of the Empire is pretty massive and this also grants a few stacks of might on dodge. It does cost a large chunk of your damage though, and you shouldn't take this whenever you're not alone. The same applies to using Salvation instead of Invocation. You lose a lot of damage, but you gain a lot of survivability. Salvation makes your dodge heal allies and cleanse a condition, applies barrier in frequent intervals for every boon that you have on you, and gives you a 15% reduced damage taken mod via Unyielding Devotion. Finally, you can replace any piece of Berserker's gear with Knights, giving you toughness in exchange for the same amount in power and ferocity. This is a 1-to-1 trade-off in damage, but can provide a more relaxed experience. Stacking these defensive options will make you basically unkillable, but also makes you hit like a wet noodle. Okay, let's talk about boon coverage. What I usually do in Open World is to swap in a few Diviner trinkets. They make covering boons on yourself much easier and don't cost a lot of gold for the full set. Let's begin with Vigor. Vigor is a quite essential boon because dodges are a quite integral part of your gameplay regardless of the trait choices you make. The easiest way to cover it, which costs a bit of gold unfortunately, is to use a Relic of Evasion. This gives you Vigor whenever you evade an attack, which is quite often. If you don't want to spend the money for an extra relic, you can keep the Thief relic and use the Bowl of Orient Truffle and Meat Stew for close to the same effect. It is generally cheaper but removes the ability to use other survivability food. In terms of other offensive boons like Might, Fury and Quickness, the legendary Alliance stance allows you to cover those quite easily. For Might, you can use both Selfish Spirit and Nomad's Advance. With Notoriety and Devastation, you will also gain Might whenever you use a non-weapon skill. With the trait Incensed Response, using Scavenger Burst will also grant you Might as it grants Fury. Using Scavenger Burst on cooldown is also the main way to cover Quickness and Fury on yourself, especially in AoE scenarios. It only has a 3-second cooldown, so you can use this quite often. It also grants you 20 endurance per target that you hit with it, so it allows you to dodge a lot more frequently. When it comes to defensive boons, the only option for protection you have is Vassals of the Empire. If you want a more chilled experience in solo gameplay, you can use this. Just keep in mind that this costs you the 25% damage mod from Forerunner of Death and halves the damage that your dodge does. It also removes the application of vulnerability on your dodge, making battle scars trigger less often. For easy boon coverage, you can abuse the synergy between the Relic of the Cavalier and Blast from the Skyscale to apply lots of Aegis, resistance, might and quickness to yourself. The skill Blast from the Skyscale places a damaging field, and the boons from the Relic apply on every hit of the damage field. Just mount up and press the Engage skill right after to cast it instantly. Last but not least, you can make use of Jade protocols in open world, which give 150 additional toughness, vitality, condition damage and power, as well as all boons aside from stability, resistance and resolution entering combat with a 90-second cooldown. The free stats are very nice to have, especially for harder open world content. Another fun interaction that you can make use of in general roaming is the Superior Sigil of Stamina. This will refill your entire endurance bar whenever you kill an enemy, which can mean basically infinite dodges as long as you keep killing stuff. The last part of an open world build is how to deal with conditions and control effects. Your heal skill on the Dwarf stand, Soothing Stone, cleanses multiple conditions off of you. It also grants resolution, reducing the damage you take from conditions by 33%. Aside from that, the best option you have for frequent condition cleanses is to put a Superior Sigil of Purity on another cheap exotic Berserker weapon. Simply swap to that weapon whenever you encounter condition heavy enemies. In addition to these changes, you can use Cleansing Channel in Invocation for one condition cleanse on every Legends one. This does cost a 10% damage modifier from Rising Tide though, so I don't really think it's worth it. Against particularly nasty condition heavy enemies, you can make use of the Salvation trait line instead of Invocation to have a condition cleanse on your dodge. When it comes to stun breaks, you have two options in the build, Reaver's Rage and Rite of the Great Dwarf. With Contain Temper and Invocation, you will gain 15 energy back whenever you break a stun, making Reaver's Rage free of charge, and Rite of the Great Dwarf costs 25 energy. Rite of the Great Dwarf is still pretty expensive, but also reduces incoming damage by 50% for 5 seconds after. I still recommend prioritizing Reaver's Rage whenever it's possible, simply because it's the better option. Last but not least, you can use Inspiring Reinforcement to apply pulsing stability to yourself and allies around you. This allows you to ignore incoming control effects entirely for the duration. Right, you should now have an idea on how you can play Power Vindicator in both open world and instance content. That's it for today. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Power Vindicator. See you next time and happy bouncy balling!